Hi, everyone, and welcome to the Literary Lens podcast, where I am delighted to have three of my own clients talking about novels in verse, because we get a lot of questions from our people who follow the podcast about how do you write a novel in verse? When do you write a novel in verse? When might it not be a good idea? How do you learn to? So what I'm going to do is I am going to invite each of my authors to introduce themselves and their books. And most of these books have been award winners and JLG selections, so you're listening to some really experts in this field. So let me start with Sidura Ludwig.
Thanks, Jackie. Hi, my name is Sidura Ludwig. I live in Thornhill, Ontario, which is in the Greater Toronto area. I am the author of the middle grade novel SWAN, The Girl Who Grew. It was published by Nimbus Publishing in September 2024.
Thank you. And just going in order on my screen, we have Thushanthi Ponweera joining us all the way from Qatar, I think. So talk about your book.
Hi, everyone. I'm Thushanthi. When I sold the book, I was in Sri Lanka, but we recently moved to Qatar. This is my middle grade verse novel. I am KAVI. It's historical fiction, and it came out in 2023, September.
And that was with Holiday House, just in case people are following the publishers. And yes. I think the person I've been with the longest here, and I've certainly known the longest, is Lyn Miller-Lachmann, who is an award-winning author of both prose and novels in verse, and she has 2 novels in verse that she can talk about.
Well, thank you very much, Jackie, and thank you all for listening. I'm Lyn Miller-Lachmann. I live in New York City, which is kind of an interesting place to have a large Lego town in a tiny New York City apartment. But I am the author of Eyes Open, which is a young adult verse novel that came out in 2024, and the co-author of Moonwalking, which is a middle grade novel. I wrote it with Zetta Elliott, and that came out in 2022.
And I guess we should mention that Eyes Open was with Carol Rhoda Lerner, and Moonwalking was FSG.
Right.
So thank you all for being here. We will put links to all of these books beneath the recording, so if anyone wants to read them, that will be available to you. But I want to kick off just asking the question about what attracted you to the novel in verse format for these various novels. And I might start with Lyn, because I know you had a slightly different entree because you were co-authoring your first novel in verse.
Well, it wasn't my first novel in verse that I started writing. I started writing Eyes Open before Moonwalking. And the reason that I wrote that one in verse is because I had written another YA novel manuscript set at the same time, which is Portugal in the 1960s during a right-wing dictatorship. And that novel was not working because the main character was kind of a passive protagonist. She was an observer rather than a doer for the most part. And there was another character in the novel who was doing a whole lot, most of it making trouble for everybody. And her distinction in the novel as a secondary character was that she started a poetry club at her girls' Catholic school to write poems clandestinely to honor her boyfriend, who was in prison for circulating banned materials during this dictatorship. So I realized that she was the one that was stirring up all the trouble. Maybe I should, make her the main character. And because she was writing poetry and she was fascinated with poetry and its sort of revolutionary abilities, that the book would be a verse novel.
Oh.
So I started writing it, and then I met with Zetta, who was just by coincidence, looking to co-author a verse novel. And because I'd already written about 2/3 of this novel, I had the self-confidence. Maybe it's one of these cases of a little education is a bad thing. I had the confidence to say yes.
Lovely. And this might be a good way to segue into Thushanti's verse novel, because Lyn is talking about a character who's a poet, and that being a very logical reason to write in verse. Thushanthi herself is a bit of a poet, so why don't you talk about why you chose that format?
So I happen to have discovered verse novels only a few months before I started attempting to write one. And it's still very much a new thing, I think, a new concept as a book in this part of the world. I recently met with a bunch of year 10 students, so 15-year-old students in my kids' school over here. And it was the first time they had seen a verse novel. And it's not that they are not well read, it's just that it's not freely available here, I guess. And I think I admire the American publishing system for always, being kind of very progressive in that sense. So since I was young, I had always written free verse. Like the poetry that I would write would be free verse. It would never rhyme. It was never too deep or too literary. It was always very easy to understand. So when I discovered verse novels, I was like, hey, that's the kind of poetry I write. And this if I can make this into a novel, that would be amazing. So that was what kind of made me try. And I was also encouraged by the short word count. So I wasn't intimidated by writing a 50,000 word novel. Because when I was doing research, I was reading that Sharon Creech's novels were as short as 14,000 words sometimes. So that kind of gave me the confidence to attempt my first verse novel. I think when I showed it to you, Jackie, it was around, this is a question a lot of people ask me. I think it was around 17,000 words, but after many rounds of editing, it, I think, ended up around 24,000.
Yeah,
which is still pretty low.
Yeah, no, but it's and we'll talk about the virtues of that exactly in a minute as compared to prose novels. But I know Sidura's entree into novels in verse was also different, because this came from working with an MFA instructor.
So yes and no.
Yes and no.
I didn't set out to write a verse novel. The way I kind of stumbled into writing this novel in verse is so my novel is also historical fiction, like Thushanti's, but it takes place in Nova Scotia in the mid-1800s, and it's based on the life of a real woman who was born and lived there at the time. Her name was Anna SWAN, and she grew to be almost 8 feet tall. And in my novel, I imagine what her life might have been like when she was 12 years old. So that's the premise of this novel. And I discovered that, or rather was introduced to her story on a family trip to Nova Scotia almost 13 years ago, and had been holding on to, knowing I wanted to do something with this story, but not sure how I wanted to tell it. And so over the years, I would come back to it. I would try different formats. None of them were sitting well with me. And in fact, what I was struggling with the most was connecting with my character's voice. And then I did an MFA at Vermont College of Fine Arts in writing for children and young adults. And through that program was introduced to verse novels. I probably had not read one before. I was really, I think like Thushanthi, really connected with it, because when I did write poetry, or when I do write poetry, I'm also free verse, also very visual. And so I thought, you know what, why not? This is a perfect opportunity, because when you're in school and you're a student, you just got to try. And it's what have you got to lose? And so I thought, I'm going to give this a try. And I actually had taken a semester off and decided in that semester to do both my research and then what I called like a discovery draft. And so I just started, as I was doing research, I would then also write poems based on what I was researching, elements of the story of her life that I found interesting. And that was how it started. So it became a verse novel through my own discovery.
See, it's fascinating because I've worked on all these books with all of you, and I'm hearing things that I didn't even know. Like, I knew bits of this, but I didn't know everything. One thing two things actually struck me as you were all talking. One is the connection between historical fiction and verse, because all of you have written historical fiction verse novels. The other is one that I think about when I talk to authors, the connection between picture book writing and verse because of the compressed format. I know two of you, Sidura and Thushanthi, really do write a lot of picture books, and I'm curious and Lyn has written picture books, but predominantly writes prose novels other than novels in verse. I'm interested if anyone, I might start with the picture books and come back to the historical. Does anyone have a thought about whether there is this relationship between picture books and novels in verse, whether it helps that if you're more comfortable with the picture book format? Anyone want to jump into that one?
I can start.
Go for it.
So I was recently thinking about this whole rule of showing versus telling, and I think there is nothing that does it better than picture books. One thing is when you're writing, you need to kind of fill in more details than when you do picture books, where ideally you're supposed to leave 50% of the story to the illustrator. So I think when you start from that point of view, you are used to really condensing the story to what's really necessary and things that really move the story forward in as few words as possible. So when you take a verse novel, every verse kind of takes you closer to the next point of the story, similar to a chapter, but just much shorter. So I think in that sense, there's a lot of space left for the reader to create their own visual, their own narrative for the things left unsaid. So the blank space in a verse novel can actually be compared to the pictures that are drawn in a picture book. That's what I feel.
Sidura, do you have thoughts?
Yeah, I was just going to jump in. I love that idea that the blank space in the verse novel can be compared to the illustrations in a picture book. I think that's very true. And it really is, when you're writing in verse, a challenge of trusting your reader and letting what isn't being said say what needs to be said. For me, the link that I see between my picture book writing and the verse novel experience is that when you're writing a picture book, you have to get to the heart of that story. And my edits in picture books are often because I'm not there yet. It can take a while to get there. And that was the same experience for me in writing the verse novel. It really forced me to understand what was the heart of my story. I could not write around that heart. I needed to know it. I needed to get right in there. And then each poem was more like a snapshot. A friend of mine who's starting into writing some verse novels now, she talked about it as if you had a bunch of photographs and then you have to put them together into an album. And I loved that analogy. But I really, I think each poem gets at the heart of the character's emotion in the same way that in the picture book you have to get at the heart of what your story is.
Yeah, that's a great thought. Thank you.
And I'd like to come from
please.
a different place, because I did not start by writing picture books, but back in the day, I dreamed of becoming a singer-songwriter. And I couldn't sing, and I really couldn't play an instrument. I did become a DJ and played a lot of songs that are really narrative poetry.
Mm-hmm. And
in both Moonwalking and Eyes Open, music plays a really important role in the story. JJ, like me, dreams of being a songwriter in the style of Joe Strummer of The Clash. And in Eyes Open, the whole rhythm of the poetry is drawn from the Portuguese musical genre of fado. That's
so interesting, because that connects beautifully with the question I was going to ask you first, and all three of you, about the connection between maybe making history accessible and using verse. Lyn is making this connection with the music of that time period and how that can be reflected in the verse. But I did note, and people say you rep novels in verse, what would you advise someone? I'm like, I just do historical niche kinds of novels in verse, but it is the verse format does make the history come alive. I know when Thushanthi and I started working and I said, well, this is a historical novel, and you're like, no, it's not. This is just my childhood. I'm like, hey, that's historical.
You just call me old.
I guess that was a way of calling it old.
That was yeah.
So you weren't thinking that it was a historical novel, but Sidura was obviously writing something, very consciously historical. You did say you considered writing it in lots of different ways, and you explained how the verse came to you. Do you think it helps elevate the history piece to present it in that way?
I think it does. I did a lot of research, but where I think it helps to elevate the history piece is the verse allows me to focus in on like key details that draw the setting, that make the setting come alive. And so there's a lot of space for the reader to fill in those gaps in terms of imagination. But if when I'm writing a poem, for example, about my character, that there was a moment where she grew too big to sit at the table comfortably with her family. She ended up having to sit and eat on the floor. And so I drew, I created a scene around that. But how do I create those kinds of details? What do I focus on? You would use that in prose writing too. But there's, but the weight of those details hang heavier in a verse novel, perhaps than in prose. And I do think it's the details that make historical fiction alive.
And at the risk of embarrassing myself, Thushanthi, did you want to say anything about the history piece, or are you still getting over the fact that it is history?
No, it's fine. What I think is interesting is I think my approach was completely opposite to Sidura's, where I thought that verse was a way of kind of refraining from putting in too many details historically, because for me, the backdrop was the war, and it was something that I had personal feelings about. So I didn't want it to get there to be too many details that would kind of bring this piece down, because I wanted to be an uplifting story. I didn't want it to get lost in the details. I didn't want KAVI's journey to get lost in this whole other historical background, which was important, but then that wasn't the main, it wasn't at the forefront of the story. So I think writing in verse kind of helped me keep her voice alive and her journey at the front of it. While also giving the reader some glimpse of, what it was like to live during a war. So I think for me, it was a way of trimming down the details that may sometimes, bring a reader down emotionally, which in adult novels, you're kind of given the leeway to do that a bit more, but I didn't want it to be the experience for a young reader.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And one of the yes, please, Sidura.
I'm so excited.
Yes.
I want to jump in to say that yes, that was I wanted to point out as well that with the verse novel, because we get to be so much inside our character's head in terms of making the history accessible, you're really experiencing that history through a very very keen perception that through what the character is really thinking and feeling. And I found that as well, that when I finally settled on the verse format, my character came alive for me, her experience came alive for me, and then, the setting also came alive.
And it's actually, very hard for me to imagine either of those novels, SWAN or I Am KAVI, as prose novels, because I saw them as that was my first introduction to them as a agent. But in Lyn's case, as she said, with Eyes Open, I'd seen bits and pieces of various iterations of those characters. And, one of the questions I did want to delve into on the podcast was the difference between prose and poetry. and how you think the story would have been different in prose. And I think Lyn has some experience of that because she did play with her characters in prose.
Yes. I mean, the previous manuscript that was never published was a prose manuscript. And most of my others have been as well, including when you mentioned, Thushanthi, about the 17,000 words. I had just, my previous book at one point was 92,000 words before it, I cut it down to 82,000 when Torch, in fact, came out, maybe 83,000. But yeah, that was a pretty long novel by YA standards, particularly these days because books are getting shorter. But in this particular case, I really didn't feel I had a choice. This was a character who was telling me that this had to be a verse novel. And it was not only capturing the poetry of the time, the fado, which was a music form heavily censored by the fascist regime, but also that one of the turning points of the book is when her family, her uncle, hires a band singer who plays a band song, and then somebody who they don't know informs on them to the police and causes the family's restaurant to be shut down. So, yes, so the fado, the poetry, and she is struggling throughout the book between writing poems to honor a hero because she sees her boyfriend as a hero, and then when she has to go out and work at a dirty and dangerous job, to step up and become the hero herself.
Yeah, I love that. I love that about that novel, but in a sense, I love that about all of your novels featuring the female protagonist. So putting Moonwalking to one side. Just sticking with Lyn for a second, because one of the questions I did want to raise, and you're the one person on our panel who's done this, do you see differences in writing in this format for the young adult market versus the middle grade market? You were kind of doing both at the same time because you had your Eyes Open going, and then you worked with Zeta on Moonwalking, and then you were sort of switching gears.
Right. I think a lot of it is actually the content. And, as I told people, in various appearances that I've made for both Moonwalking and Eyes Open, that what makes Eyes Open young adult above anything else is that it involves boyfriends plural.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So I think a lot of it is the content, it's the age of the character, it's the themes of the work that make it more appropriate for a young adult audience than a middle grade audience. But also with the poetry in Eyes Open, it's more self-referential. She is aware that she is a poet and that her poems have power. I mean, that's what she comes to discover. And they have the power to change the world in a way that in a middle grade novel is somebody with less power, who's more focused on home and friends and family than going out in working and, making a stand in society at a demonstration is different.
Yep. So I might ask, I think, one more substantive question and then do a couple of lightning rounds. My substantive question, and I do want to ask this because I know authors watch and listen to the podcast and people may want to sort of get up and try and write in this format. So let me start with asking, I'll just go around in a circle and put Sidura on the spot. what do you find are some of the challenges of writing and editing a novel in verse? And if you don't want to go first, you don't have to.
No, that's all right. I'll jump in there. I'll figure it out. What were some of the challenges? There was a real challenge for me in terms of figuring out my novel structure and plot structure, and that's because I said my very first draft of this was a discovery draft, which I was writing while I was researching. I would come up with different interesting points that I found about Anna Swan, and then I would sit down, and write some poems. And I sort of, also I was writing historical fiction based on the life of a real person. So, there are challenges in terms of that. What do you keep? What do you not keep? What do you fill in? But I would say, that for me, I found that challenging. It took a few rounds for me to figure out what my story was, and then what my structure was going to be, and making sure that I still had that narrative arc that's so important. Particularly, it has to be a strong narrative arc. The language can be lovely, but if there's no strong narrative arc, you're not going to keep your reader there. The challenge for editing, it was the same kind of challenges that I have in any of my books, and it comes back to plot. It comes back to I tend to write very quiet, which is maybe why the verse novel worked for me. I think I lean lyrical. But is the story jumping enough off? Is it compelling enough to reach a reader? Is my character's internal struggle compelling enough? And am I, I love quiet characters. Quiet characters can actually say a lot more than what I guess would be a loud character. But am I doing that job? And am I, and then, because this was a story based on a real person, am I doing her justice? Am I telling the story that I need to tell, but am I also doing Anna Swan justice? So those were some of the things that I was wrestling with while writing and editing.
You're the only one of these books that is based on a real person. I think everyone else might have drawn from research and knowledge, but created purely fictional characters, and you had that additional layer that you were dealing with. What do others think about the biggest challenges of writing and or editing in this format?
So like Sidura said, I think I veer towards more literary writing as well. So I think with verse, what happens is I need to be aware of staying true to the voice and the age of my character, because when you write a bit literally and you write in verse, sometimes it can sound a bit adult, it can sound a bit mature. So I don't necessarily think that verse has to be literal, in the sense, I know because it's verse, it kind of ages up the character, but that doesn't have to be the case. And I think another challenge that I had was the number of characters. Like whenever I introduce a character, I want to make sure that they're essential to the story. Then do I have enough room in this novel to kind of wrap up everyone's character arcs? And there are instances where I feel like there are less characters than naturally there would be in real life. So sometimes those are the things I struggle with. But honestly, I love editing verse, and it's easier for me to add more words in verse than it would be in prose. Like even now I would like to write in prose, but then suddenly I'm like, why am I writing all these words when I can say it in verse? So I'm getting there someday maybe.
Yeah, cool. Lyn, what are your thoughts on writing and editing?
I thought for me, the most challenging thing about writing in verse is world building. I have the opposite problem. I want action and more action. And I think that with Zeta, we were very complementary in that way, because I gave the story its narrative spine.
Yep.
And she handled the world building and did so brilliantly. When you read Moonwalking, the poem Sugarland is a model of world building in a verse novel. The way it captures life in Williamsburg, Brooklyn, in 1982, which is absolutely not what Williamsburg, Brooklyn is now. It's become very gentrified. But the thing is, there's a reason that you don't see many verse novels in like fantasy and science fiction, because they are so dependent on world building.
Yeah.
And when I started Eyes Open, I felt like the world building was really thin. I mean, I used to live in Portugal, and you would like have to go to Portugal to understand that this is a different world from, the United States today. And well, it's not so different nowadays, but at the same time, I was able, by working with Zeta on Moonwalking, I was able to go back in Eyes Open and add a lot of the world building details.
Yeah.
And do so in a fairly concise way.
Yeah, it's the result is absolutely beautiful, of course, and very, very much love that book. I'm going to do a couple of lightning rounds because of time, and particularly because Thushanthi probably needs to go to bed at some point. We're all in different countries. We have Canada, we have the US, we have Qatar. I won't say I'm in the Midwest, so I'm nowhere interesting. So the two questions I wanted to ask, so you can think about them, is what piece of advice would you give to an author thinking about writing a novel in verse for the first time? That's one of my questions. And my other question is, do you have a favorite novel in verse outside your own work that you would recommend people read who are interested in writing in this vein? So shall I start with the piece of advice so people can think about which novel they want to recommend if they have one? What is the number one piece of advice you would give to anyone thinking about playing in this genre, Thushanthi?
Just read as many verse novels as you can. There are so many more now, I think, than when I started writing verse, and they're just so varied. But as Lyn said, they do tend to stick to a few genres. But just read as much as you can, because there's quite a range of verse novels, and you can find where you fit in that way.
Wonderful. Lyn, what would you say?
I agree on the reading, but also if you get a chance, take a class with Cordelia Jensen.
Oh, yes.
Yes, she advised me when I first started writing Eyes Open, and she was just starting to teach the verse novels. And she told me, she just gave me such important advice, among which was the image system, which you can see brilliantly used in her books. I ended up adapting it with my love of music to the rhythms of the music of the time. But yes, Cordelia Jensen.
Yes, if anyone's interested in following up on her books or her classes, it's JENSEN, isn't it?
That is correct.
Yeah. Sidura.
Those are both great pieces of advice, and the one I'm going to add to it is just start out by playing. Don't get too overwhelmed with the idea of writing a verse novel. Allow yourself to explore your characters and ideas. But the beauty of poetry is that you can do that. So when I first started writing SWAN in that first discovery draft, I challenged myself to write 5 to 10 poems each time I sat down. Usually it was more like 5. But the point was that by keeping it smaller, it allowed me to play in the format. And I think playing in the format is what's going to tell you whether this is the right format for you for the story you want to tell.
Great.
Oh yeah. And wait, just to add to that, in the vein of playing, there were moments where certain poems or scenes would come into my head, and I just type them out on my phone. It's a verse. It's really easy to type out really quickly, 5-10 minutes, and it may not even have been something that I intended to have in the story, like if I'm looking at my outline, but then I found ways to build it in. That goes with the playing part as well. Just write whenever you want, whatever you want, and then just have it ready for when you want to build it into the bigger story.
So my final lightning round question, if anyone has thought of any, Lyn is probably going to recommend a favorite book by Cordelia or not.
I did mention Cordelia, but the book that inspired me the most in writing Eyes Open was Elizabeth Acevedo's The Poet X.
Oh, yes.
Yes, read anything by Elizabeth Acevedo.
Yep. Sidura, what would be your pick?
Poet X was my second pick. The first one that came to mind. Oh, actually, I've got two now. Other Words for Home by Jasmine Warga. Great middle grade. Beautiful middle grade novel in verse. And then also, the title is May Be. B is in the letter. And I'm afraid I've blanked on the author's name.
Oh, I don't know that.
Carolyn Cooney, I think.
Carolyn Cooney?
Maybe.
Yes.
I don't know if it's Carolyn Cooney, but anyway, it's Maybe, and it's another historical fiction, and that had a huge impact on me when I was writing SWAN.
Oh, lovely. Thank you. And Thushanthi, are you going to pick Rajani LaRocca or someone else?
So as Sidura said, Other Words for Home was my inspiration as well, Jasmine Warga. Yes, and Rajani LaRocca as well, similar style of writing.
She's
and
wonderful.
I really
love her.
Yeah. And I really enjoy Reem Faruqi's books. She's put out quite a few verse novels now, and she really knows how to get to write like heart-rending stories, but really lyrically. So those are some authors that I can relate to.
Yeah. And what we will do is collect all of those and put them in the comments in the podcast, so people who want to find those books will have a list of them. But I think we're coming up on time, so I'd very, very much like to thank my clients for talking to us about novels in verse, Lyn Miller-Lachmann, Thushanthi Ponweera, and Sidura Ludwig, whose name I mispronounced the first time because I was reading it rather than thinking about it. It's just been wonderful to have you on the Literary Lens, and I hope we can do it again sometime. And if people have questions or comments about novels in verse, please feel free to share them in the comments. And if we have the time, we can go back to the authors and get some answers for you. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you, Jackie. Thanks for having us.
Bye.